On the crisp afternoon of February 13, 2017, Abigail Williams and Liberty German set out on what was meant to be a simple outdoor adventure. Dropped off at the Monon High Bridge Trail by a relative, the two close friends, Abby just 13 and Libby 14, intended to enjoy the freedom of a day off from school, exploring the old railroad bridge and the surrounding wooded areas. But when they failed to show up at the pre-arranged pickup spot later that afternoon, concern quickly escalated. Family members and friends combed the trail, their flashlights cutting through the evening gloom. Despite hours of searching, there was no sign of the girls. As night fell over Delphi, a sense of growing dread settled over the small Indiana town. The next morning, on February 14, searchers made a grim discovery. Abby and Libby's bodies were found about half a mile from the Monon High Bridge, in a heavily wooded area near Deer Creek. It was not simply a case of two teenagers lost to the wilderness, it was immediately clear that a brutal crime had taken place. When authorities processed the crime scene, the horror of what had been done to the girls emerged in devastating detail. Both Abby and Libby had suffered catastrophic injuries. Their throats had been slit with such force that blood stained not just their clothing and the ground beneath them, but even the nearby trees. The violence had been frenzied, deliberate, and close-range. Adding an even more disturbing element, investigators noted that tree branches had been placed atop their bodies. These branches were not randomly scattered, they were deliberately arranged in a V-shaped or cross-shaped pattern over the girls. This chilling staging suggested that whoever had killed Abby and Libby had taken time after the murders to manipulate the scene, leaving behind a grotesque and confusing message. The brutality and staging left a deep mark on the investigators who first arrived. Many seasoned law enforcement officers later said they had never encountered such a horrifying scene in their entire careers. The crime's viciousness indicated a perpetrator capable of extreme violence, and possibly driven by dark, ritualistic impulses. Law enforcement immediately classified the case as a double homicide. Yet, for all the obvious signs of violence, authorities chose to release only the most basic information to the public. They withheld many of the gory details, hoping to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Even so, critical evidence surfaced early. Authorities recovered data from Libby's cell phone, and what it revealed was nothing short of heroic. In her final moments, Libby had the presence of mind to start recording. The short video captured a man approaching the girls on the bridge. His voice, low and commanding, instructed them to go down the hill. This recording, both audio and visual, became the cornerstone of the investigation. Police released a snippet of the audio and a still image taken from the video, hoping someone would recognize the man's voice or appearance. Despite the release of two separate composite sketches over the years, leads dried up, and public frustration grew. It seemed incomprehensible that in a town as small as Delphi, the killer could remain free. Over the years, countless rumors circulated. Some speculated about ritualistic killings, others wondered if a local had orchestrated the murders. What was undeniable was the methodical savagery of the attack and the eerie precision with which the crime scene had been arranged. Authorities continued to insist that the case was very much active, not cold. They combed through thousands of tips, conducted countless interviews, and repeatedly urged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. Then, in a stunning turn, 5.5 years after Abby and Libby's lives were stolen, authorities announced a major breakthrough. On October 26, 2022, Richard Allen, a 52-year-old pharmacy technician living quietly in Delphi, was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. Allen was no stranger to police. He had been interviewed back in 2017, just days after the murders. At that time, he had told investigators he had been on the Monon High Bridge Trail the very afternoon the girls disappeared. He claimed he saw 3 females, but insisted he did not interact with them. His statement was filed away among thousands of others. It was only years later, after a methodical re-examination of all early leads, that Allen's name resurfaced. When re-interviewed in October 2022, Allen again admitted he had been on the trail and that he had encountered 3 juvenile girls. However, this time, inconsistencies in his account raised red flags. A subsequent search of Allen's home led investigators to a critical piece of forensic evidence, a .40 caliber pistol. Testing revealed that an unspent bullet found between the bodies of Abby and Libby had been cycled through Allen's weapon. Though it had not been fired, the bullet bore markings that linked it unmistakably to his gun. Allen claimed he had never been near the spot where the bullet was found and had no explanation for how a round associated with his gun ended up at the crime scene. As Allen sat in jail awaiting trial, even more damning evidence surfaced. In a monitored phone call to his wife, he allegedly confessed to killing the girls, not once, but 7 separate times during the same conversation. Other confessions followed while Allen was incarcerated, many of them recorded or witnessed by jail staff. Judge Frangull later ruled that these confessions could be introduced as evidence during the trial. Allen's defense team fought to suppress the statements, arguing that he was mentally ill and had not confessed voluntarily. Nevertheless, prosecutors believed the evidence against Allen was overwhelming. As the trial date approached, a community that had lived in fear and sorrow for more than half a decade braced for the painful details that would emerge. They had waited years for answers, and justice for Abby and Libby seemed closer than ever. As news of Richard Allen's arrest spread, the quiet streets of Delphi buzzed with disbelief. A man so ordinary, someone who filled prescriptions and exchanged small talk with neighbors, was now accused of a crime that had shattered the town's sense of security. Few could reconcile the familiar face behind the pharmacy counter with the savage murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. Prosecutors moved swiftly to establish their case. They leaned heavily on the physical evidence, the unspent bullet discovered between the girls' bodies that had unmistakably passed through Allen's .40 caliber pistol. Though the bullet had not been fired, the specific markings it carried could be traced back to Allen's weapon with scientific certainty. For investigators, this link was a critical breakthrough, providing a tangible tie between Allen and the crime scene. But the bullet was not the only damning piece of evidence. Investigators had long struggled with the fact that the crime scene had been disturbingly staged. The thick branches placed carefully over the girls' bodies in a deliberate V shape hinted at deeper, perhaps ritualistic motives. In 2017, an FBI agent even noted in a search warrant request that the bodies appeared to have been moved and staged. Although prosecutors chose not to present theories of ritual sacrifice to the jury, the eerie symbolism of the scene remained a chilling backdrop to the trial. Adding further weight to the prosecution's case were Allen's own words. According to court documents, during a phone call from jail in April 2022, Allen confessed to his wife that he was responsible for the girls' deaths. Not once, but 7 times, he acknowledged his guilt before his wife abruptly ended the call. Over subsequent months, Allen allegedly made additional confessions to correctional staff and inmates, admissions that Judge Frangull ruled admissible in court. The defense, however, launched an aggressive effort to suppress these confessions. They contended that Allen was suffering from profound mental health issues during his time in jail, rendering his statements unreliable. According to his attorneys, Allen was isolated, deteriorating mentally, and desperate for human contact, conditions they argued made any statements he made involuntary. Despite these arguments, the court maintained that the confessions were fair evidence for the jury to consider. This decision significantly bolstered the prosecution's position, offering jurors not just physical evidence but Allen's own voice tying him to the crime. As the trial commenced, the prosecution delivered powerful opening statements, outlining the nightmare that had unfolded in the woods near Delphi's Monon High Bridge. They emphasized the brutality of the murders, describing how the girls had been attacked and how their killer had lingered long enough to arrange branches into a grotesque display over their bodies. Prosecutors asserted that Richard Allen had not simply stumbled upon Abby and Libby, he had planned, executed, and coldly desecrated their young lives. Courtroom attendees braced themselves as the prosecution began presenting crime scene photos. Over 40 images were introduced into evidence, some so graphic they drew gasps from those present. The images depicted the secluded patch of forest where Abby and Libby were found, bloodstains smeared across the soil and trees, and the haunting arrangement of thick branches across their small bodies. Each photo was shown with solemn care, reinforcing the brutality of what had been done and driving home the horror that Abby and Libby must have endured. Jurors saw the reality that words could not fully convey, the terror frozen in time beneath the skeletal arms of the trees. Beyond the physical and testimonial evidence, the prosecution also painted a portrait of Allen's movements on the day of the murders. He had been seen walking along the trail near the Monon High Bridge that afternoon, the same area where Abby and Libby had vanished. His own admission, both in 2017 and again in 2022, placed him at the scene, further tightening the noose around him. Notably, Allen's timeline raised troubling questions. While he admitted to seeing 3 juvenile girls near the bridge, he claimed he had no interaction with them and left the area shortly thereafter. Yet cell phone data, witness accounts, and his inconsistent statements suggested he had lingered longer than he admitted. Adding yet another layer to the prosecution's case was the behavior Allen exhibited in the months and years following the murders. Despite living just minutes from the crime scene, he never came forward voluntarily after the police released images and audio recordings of the suspect. Some prosecutors argued that his silence spoke volumes, a sign of a guilty conscience rather than an innocent bystander unaware of the gravity of what he had witnessed. Even as the case against Richard Allen grew more formidable, unanswered questions continued to haunt the trial. Early in the investigation, authorities suggested that more than one person might have been involved in the killings. Despite exhaustive efforts, no additional suspects had been arrested. For many watching the trial unfold, the possibility that others had helped, or at least knew something, lingered like a shadow at the edge of the courtroom. As week one of the trial drew to a close, the town of Delphi watched and waited, trapped between hope for justice and horror at the revelations steadily pouring out in court. For the families of Abby and Libby, each day was a renewed agony, each piece of evidence a reminder of the futures their daughters had been robbed of. Yet despite the pain, there was also determination, an unwavering resolve to see the truth fully uncovered, no matter how dark or difficult it might be. The second week of testimony would reveal even more unsettling details, as both sides prepared to battle over the soul of the case, whether Richard Allen would be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt for one of the most haunting crimes Delphi had ever endured. As the second week of Richard Allen's trial began, the defense team launched their counterattack. They sought to introduce doubt, painting the case against Allen as circumstantial and deeply flawed. While prosecutors leaned heavily on forensic evidence, jailhouse confessions, and Allen's own shifting statements, the defense argued that the state's narrative lacked the certainty required to convict. One of the defense's primary arguments centered on contamination and mishandling of evidence. They suggested that the unspent .40 caliber round found near the girls' bodies could have been placed there by accident or tampering, either during the chaotic crime scene investigation or afterward. They questioned how a bullet could be cycled through Allen's gun but never fired, arguing that without proof of when and how it ended up between Abby and Libby, the connection remained speculative. Defense attorneys also pressed on the conditions of Allen's confessions. They introduced expert testimony suggesting that prolonged isolation, depression, and psychological stress can lead individuals to make false admissions of guilt. Allen's defense painted him as a broken man, worn down by months of incarceration and mental deterioration, not a cold-blooded murderer. However, prosecutors were quick to counter. They reminded the jury that Allen's admissions had occurred multiple times to different people, not merely under interrogation pressure. He confessed spontaneously, not during aggressive questioning, but in phone calls and casual conversations within the jail. Moreover, the forensic match between his pistol and the bullet remained a stubborn, immovable fact. Witnesses continued to take the stand, further cementing the timeline of that tragic February day. Several people recounted seeing a man, later matched to Allen's description, wearing jeans and a dark blue jacket, lingering near the Monon High Bridge. His demeanor was described as tense, almost agitated. No one could recall seeing him after the girls vanished, only before. One particularly emotional moment came when Libby German's grandmother testified about the audio clip found on Libby's phone. She spoke of the bravery her granddaughter showed by capturing the video and recording the man's voice instructing the girls to go down the hill. That grainy footage and chilling voice became iconic, the last known images and sounds of Abby and Libby before they were brutally silenced. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of the video, arguing that countless men could match the build and clothing shown in the recording. But the proximity of Allen's home to the trail, his prior acknowledgement that he was on the path that day, and the mounting physical evidence made these arguments feel thin against the total weight of the prosecution's case. Midway through the trial, the court revisited earlier investigative missteps. Defense attorneys pointed out that for years, multiple sketches of possible suspects had confused the public. They argued that law enforcement's shifting focus and public appeals reflected uncertainty. Yet prosecutors responded sharply, acknowledging the early missteps, but emphasizing that advances in forensic science, improved evidence testing, and Allen's own self-incriminating behavior eventually led investigators to the right man. One of the more controversial aspects of the case resurfaced as well, the theory that Abby and Libby's murders were part of a ritualistic or staged crime. Although prosecutors avoided suggesting religious or cult-like motives, they presented testimony showing that the deliberate V shape made by the branches covering the girls was not random. It reflected intention, control, and a chilling level of post-mortem interaction, evidence, they argued, of a calculated, predatory mind at work. As testimony neared its conclusion, the court heard from experts in forensic pathology who described the girls' injuries in brutal detail. Both Abby and Libby had suffered fatal wounds to the neck, with the manner and placement suggesting swift, lethal violence. Blood at the scene indicated they died near where they were found. Yet the addition of tree branches and the careful arrangement of their bodies told a darker story. The killer had lingered after death, imposing his final message. Throughout the proceedings, Richard Allen remained mostly emotionless. He listened as former neighbors testified about his polite demeanor, his seemingly normal life. It was the same chilling dichotomy seen so often in true crime, the monster hiding behind an ordinary face. In closing arguments, prosecutors drove home the theme of justice long delayed but not denied. They urged the jury to see through the defense's smoke and mirrors, to focus on the overwhelming body of evidence, the bullet, the video, the confessions, the bloodstained trail, and deliver the verdict that Abby and Libby deserved. The defense pleaded for mercy, asking the jury to consider the possibility of a rush to judgment and the dangers of relying too heavily on circumstantial connections. They reminded the panel that reasonable doubt, however small, must result in acquittal. The courtroom sat in tense silence as the jury retired to deliberate. Outside, the town of Delphi seemed frozen, trapped between hope and fear. For 7 long years, the murders had haunted every corner of the community. Businesses displayed purple ribbons in memory of the girls. Candlelight vigils flickered year after year, refusing to let the memory of Abby and Libby fade. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The verdict was read aloud in a hushed courtroom. Guilty. Gasps and muffled sobs filled the room. Some wept openly. Others sat still, absorbing the enormity of the moment. Justice, long elusive, had at last been served. Richard Allen showed no visible reaction as he was led away in handcuffs. Behind him, the families of Abby and Libby clung to one another, a circle of grief, resilience, and finally, release. In Delphi, bells tolled that evening. They rang not just for Abby and Libby, but for a community that could now begin the long, painful journey toward healing. Though nothing could undo the horror that had stolen 2 young lives, the verdict marked the first true step toward peace. And in the heart of Delphi, 2 names would never be forgotten, Abigail Williams and Liberty German, whose courage and innocence would forever shine brighter than the darkness that took them. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more content like this. White have a checkmark.